originally from Canada, so I know a fair bit about this, and I have a relative who died in the raid. I'll mention that too. Welcome to the guests. I've salted the crowd with a few friends here, so if there's no applause from the members at the end, my friends will look after that. Yeah. Okay, so the subject tonight is the Dieppe raid, which occurred in 1942. What I have on the opening slide here, this is the Dieppe bar, which is worn on the Canadian Volunteer Service Medal. The bar was designed by the veterans themselves, and you can see you've got Air Force Eagle, represents the Air Force support on the day, Anchor, representing the activities of the Navy, and then there's a Thompson submachine gun, which represents the land forces, the Army. And there's a story that goes with that, the reason there's a Thompson there. And I will tell you at the end of the presentation, the story behind that bar. Okay, so the outline of the presentation. Where and when did the raid take place? Why was it undertaken? What resources were employed? What happened on the day? What did the failure cost? What are the lessons learned? And what happened in the aftermath after the raid? Because there's an epilogue. So first of all, where is Dieppe? You can see Dieppe here is in northern Normandy. Down here you have the D-Day beaches, the Cherbourg Peninsula. Le Havre is here. Paris is inland. And the biggest city near Dieppe is here, Rouen. You go up the coast and you come to Calais, Dover, and you have these channel ports here. And it was from these channel ports that the ships sailed out to the raid, and I'll show you that on a later slide. Dieppe was called the poor man's Monte Carlo because there was a casino. So if you couldn't afford to go to the real Monte Carlo, you could leave Paris, go up to Dieppe, and do your gambling. And this is a 3D montage from aerial photos of Dieppe, 1942. So what do you see? You see cliffs here, all along here, cliffs. There's a little beach in here, which was one of the landing beaches, and more cliffs. And then you come to the town of Dieppe. There's a breakwaters here. The River Arc comes from inland, passes through the town, and empties into the sea here, which is why you have this opening in the cliffs. And there's a long beach here, a shingle beach, which was the main landing beach. And then you have more cliffs. And then way over here, there's another river, dumps into the channel. This is the River Sea. And this is town of Pourville is here, which was another one of the beaches that they attacked. The cliffs were well known. Painters went there, thought they were quite beautiful. So they were painted by Monet and also by Degas. So if you're an intelligence person looking for information on Dieppe, you might go to an art museum for openers. Yeah, now this is an overview of the town. You can see the river here and the breakwaters that you saw in the photograph and this long beach. And you've got an outer port and an inner port, and you've got two mooring basins here. And the naval headquarters were in this area here. And they were one of the targets for the raid, was to get in there and raid the naval headquarters. Of all things, one of the mooring basins here is called the Bassin du Canada, because way back in the 1700s, people departed from Dieppe to go settle in Quebec in Canada. So got the name. And two other features here to take note of is here on the beach is the casino. But the Germans had started to demolish it in 1942, so it was only partially there. Bits of it were knocked down. There's also here a tobacco factory, and this was thought to be a storage area for explosives. So there was a lot of effort spent on beating up that tobacco factory, and in fact, it wasn't being used for anything. So the objectives of the raid. The term was coined a reconnaissance in force because there was a lot of people on the day. There was like 6,000 soldiers assaulted the beaches. Originally, Churchill had dreamed up an idea for 25 to 30,000 soldiers to attack the Pas de Calais. And this was the light version of his original concept. Big thing that drove the raid, the reasoning behind it, was to demonstrate to Stalin that the Allies were doing something in the West. Stalin was always complaining that he was doing all this fighting and losing all these soldiers, and nothing much was happening in the West. So they actually formed an outfit called Combined Operations. And Combined Operations started raiding the coast. And they had quite a success with the raid on Saint-Nazaire, where they destroyed the locks. And it was after that raid, Dieppe was dreamed up as the next big project. The plan was to execute a mini invasion on the coast, bring in these 6,000 soldiers, and the lessons learned would be employed in the big landing, which would happen 1943 or 1944. So they would seize and they would hold the port for most of a day, and during that time they would destroy the facilities, the cranes, all the port facilities, the docks. So when they left, it would be a wreck. This objective here did not appear until 2012 when files were opened up, and it was revealed that they were after a 4-rotor Enigma machine that they thought was in the Dieppe Naval Headquarters, and the code books to use at Bletchley Park. If you've seen the movie with Benedict Cumberbatch, where they're trying to mathematically solve the coding from the 4-rotor Enigma machine, if you had the machine itself, it makes it a lot easier. And then the Germans had radar, but it wasn't anywhere near as good as the British radar. But they wanted to know how the German radar worked. So they had a specific goal to capture the radar station near Green Beach and remove components to bring back to England. And during the raid, really for the first time over the continent, the RAF was going to attempt to achieve and maintain air superiority with aircraft flying out of Britain. So they were at kind of the toward the limit of their capabilities, and hence there was an awful lot of shuffling back and forth of aircraft going back to their bases to refuel in the UK. And then at the end of the day, they were going to recover the land force, but leave behind vehicles, tanks, and any heavy equipment that they brought with them. So that was the overview, the big picture, why they're there. And here, you see, here's a 3-rotor Enigma machine. The British had received this from the Poles just before Poland fell with the code books. So they were able to decode the Enigma signals sent by the Germans. And then in early 1942, they come up with the 4-rotor machine, and suddenly everything stopped. They couldn't decode it. So all that stuff you saw in the movie, the computers and all that, but having the machine with the code books, they would be back to where they were pre the start of 1942. And this project was being run by this guy, Ian Fleming, the guy who wrote James Bond novels. He was a lieutenant commander in the Royal Navy Intelligence, and he was waiting on the command ship for them to bring the machine and the code books out to the ship, and then he would take a torpedo boat and head off to England and take the stuff to Bletchley Park. The planning. The raid actually started out called Operation Rutter. They started the planning in early April, which was just after the raid in Saint-Nazaire. And they got to the point where everybody was on the ships and they're all ready to go, and then the weather let them down. And after sitting on the ships for about 3 days, they gave up. Took all the troops off the ships on July the 7th. But almost immediately after that, I said, well, okay, let's make a new plan for August. So let's redo the plan and look at our last chance is to get in August. Past August, we lose the weather, we lose the tides, nothing works in terms of the plan. So they immediately started planning August the 10th. They needed good weather, they needed favorable tides, they wanted a high tide just at sunrise on raid day, and they wanted sunrise around 5 o'clock, 5:20, something like that on raid day. And the plan was to come in at false dawn, like half an hour or so before sunrise. They would capture the beaches in the town, then they would push inland, and there was an airfield that was the stretch target. And then they would start withdrawing, pulling back to the beaches after about 8 to 10 hours and pull everybody off. And the date that was chosen for Operation Jubilee, the follow-up operation, was August the 19th. So, who was employed here? The resources. We had a planning staff from 3 different Army commands. And this was a bit of the first thing that caused a problem, is that the plan got handed from one group to another group to another group. Land forces, you had the Canadian Army. The Canadians had been acting as garrison troops in Britain for a couple of years and training, and they were seriously wanting to do something. So the Canadians volunteered, said, take us. We want to be in this raid. And then there was about 1,000 Royal Marine Commandos and a small contingent of US Army Rangers. Naval force, you had destroyers, about 6 gunboats, and smaller craft, motor launches, landing craft, but no big ships, no cruisers, no battleships, nothing really big. And the Air Force, most of what the Air Force supplied were fighters, fighter bombers, and there were a small number of bombers that bombed some inland targets on the day. Previous experience, what do we use to help us plan? Well, that was all they had. And of course, the people who had been involved in the planning in this were long gone. There were no lessons learned, documented really. So there was limited experience that could be taken from Gallipoli. But this rule of thumb here, those who don't know history are destined to repeat it. Mistakes on the day of the landing were repeated at Dieppe. One of the classics was when they landed at Gallipoli, the Turks were all up at the top of the hill shooting down the guys on the beaches. The same thing happened at Dieppe. They failed to take into account that the Germans were up on the cliffs. They had the advantage of being able to shoot down on the beaches. Key planners. Well, started out with the British Home Army staff. They started putting things together. They came up with an outline of a plan. Then they handed it off to Combined Operations. Combined Operations worked it until the Canadians came on board, and then it was handed off to the 2nd Canadian Division staff. And the key planner was this chap here, Clarence Mann, Brigadier. Clever guy, but had nothing to work from, no previous experience. So it was all done from scratch. And the bad thing was that the assumption was made that anything that was recommended in the previous 2 plans was not to be challenged. It was a plan by committee, effectively. They had a special guest, if you want, in that Bernard Montgomery was not busy at the time, so he was seconded into the team, and he did some of the planning. He didn't really like some of the aspects of the plan, but he didn't push back. As he was kind of getting really into it, this guy, Strafe Regat, was killed in the desert in North Africa, and he got pulled in to replace the guy commanding in North Africa to run the 8th Army, and the rest is history with El Alamein. So they ended up with a complicated plan, and it was effectively created by a committee. And this was a really complicated plan. It was like, you imagine, okay, at 10:15 we're going to be here. We're going to do this. We're going to knock out this machine gun nest, and at 10:22 we're going to be at this point on the road, and then at 10:33 we'll meet up with these other guys. It was one thing that this guy really didn't get, is that battles don't work that way. And this famous quote here from von Moltke: "No battle plan ever survives contact with the enemy." The land forces was the 2nd Canadian Division. The field commanders, there was overall commander was Hamilton Roberts. Guy was experienced from the First World War. We had Mann, who has been the planner. He was going to be on the alternate headquarters ship. You had 2 brigadiers, Southam and Sherwood-Lett. Southam was a son of a very wealthy publishing company, if you want, the News Corp of Canada. He got onto the beach and he brought the complete plan with him in a suitcase or in a briefcase, and the plan was captured, so the Germans ended up knowing all the planning that went into this. Sherwood-Lett, good general, but he never got out of his landing craft. The landing craft was shelled, he was wounded, and he spent the raid laying on his back in the landing craft, giving what orders he could. And then this chap here was a general staff guy, also on the backup headquarters ship. Canadian Army, who was there? About 5,000 soldiers, almost all young guys, under 25. Many of them had joined the Army out of the Depression, not because they wanted to so much defend the country, but they wanted 3 square meals a day, free clothing, and a place to sleep at night. But they were all volunteers. And the officers were older people, businessmen, lawyers, veterans of the First World War. The key regiments that were there: the Royal Regiment of Canada from Toronto, Douglas Cato commanding; the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry from Hamilton, Ontario; Colonel Labatt. Those of you who've ever drank Canadian beer, you would have encountered Labatt's, still a big brewery in Canada. The Essex Scottish from London, Ontario, Colonel Jasperson. You had the Fusilier Mont-Royal from Montreal, Dollard Menard commanding. The Cameron Highlanders of Canada from Winnipeg, and the South Saskatchewan Regiment, Colonel Cecil Merritt. And then tanks. The tanks came from Calgary, the 14th Canadian Army Tank Regiment. So you can see right across from one end of the country pretty well to the other, these regiments came from. And then you had specialists. There were elements from the Royal Highland Regiment mortar team. You had machine gunners from the Toronto Scottish, so bits of other regiments were also included. You had the Royal Canadian Artillery, not because there was artillery there, but should they take over any German artillery positions, the job of these guys was to turn them on the enemy. And then you had the logistics people, obviously medical, and the Provo Corps were supposed to be the beachmasters. Yeah. Royal Canadian Engineers, extremely important to work with the tanks in clearing the anti-tank obstacles. Most of the engineers were either killed or didn't get landed, so there was nobody to assist the tanks. And then you had the Royal Marine Commandos, about 1,000 of them. There were also a few Frenchmen and some European troops, which I think were probably Dutch and Belgian, to act as translators. The tanks were Churchill tanks. Good tank. The Germans didn't have particularly big anti-tank guns at the time, and there was lots of armor in the front of the Churchill, so it was quite a good tank for assaulting the beach. It could take a bruising from the Germans' guns and still keep going. But a classic flaw with this tank, which you don't really see on other tanks, is you see all of these bogey wheels. All this tight space in here. They had to land on these beaches, and these beaches were comprised of shingle, chert, which is a very hard rock, where you have the chalk cliffs, like the cliffs of Dover. There's nodules of chert embedded in the cliff, and as it erodes, the bits of chert fall down and collect and create the beach. Royal Navy, there were a number of Hunt-class destroyers, 8 in total, but 2 of them were allocated for headquarters ships, headquarters and backup. So there are only 6 available to actually do fighting support for the troops on shore. There were 3 large gunboats and 4 smaller steam gunboats, and then a whole slew of small craft. A lot of landing craft, There were a few flak ships, but a lot of these craft here were assigned to land the troops and then later on recover the troops. So there was a total of 237 small craft in addition to these larger ships. Oh, and the commander was Captain John Hughes Hallett, which I thought was kind of unusual that the guy was only a captain. I would have thought you would have had a higher rank to command an operation of this size. But he came from combined operations. They had these Hunt-class destroyers. Most of them were 4-gun destroyers, 2 4-inch in the front, 2 4-inch in the, or 2 4-inch in the stern, and 2 4-inch in the bow. I think 1 or 2 of them had 3 guns in each turret, 6 guns in total. But all up, there were about 100 4-inch guns available from the destroyers, plus whatever the gunboats were armed with. There were no capital fighting ships assigned to the raid. The Royal Navy says it's too risky to take a big ship into the channel. We don't want to lose a battleship, we don't want to lose a cruiser. Bear in mind that this was not long after they lost the Prince of Wales, having their ships destroyed by aircraft and limited maneuverability in the channel. So I said, no big ships, and as a result, there was no pre-landing heavy naval bombardment, and there wasn't even a light bombardment. They decided, let's not do this. We don't want to clutter the streets with rubble, and we don't want to kill any civilians, so no bombardment. We'll turn up on the day and start fighting. The raid was the first time that specialized landing craft had been used. So a number of different craft had been devised. You got obviously a landing craft tank here, but there were assault ships that carried troops of various sizes and different configurations. Here you see a landing craft with a scout car on it. But yeah, there's a variety of them, but most of them were new designs. So if you want, they were prototypes that were to be tested on the day. In the air, Royal Air Force, assisted by the Americans, the United States Army Air Force, they had a total of 62 fighter squadrons, fighters and fighter bombers, and then 5 squadrons of bombers. So 67 squadrons in total from the RAF, and then the US supplied 3 fighter squadrons and 4 squadrons of flying fortresses, and the flying fortresses, their main job was to attack and to knock out the aerodrome at Abbeville, which was not too far from Dieppe. So try to prevent the fighters from Abbeville getting up and fighting over the beaches. The commander in the air was Trafford Lee Mallory, who had been the head of 12 Group during the Battle of Britain. I remember the big wing, and who was the guy with no legs? Douglas Bader. He was overall commander of 12 Group. And for the same reasons that were given, the naval bombardment, no pre-raid aerial bombing, don't want to clutter up the streets, don't want to kill any civilians. Map of the town, or the town, let's say a little bit clearer than the previous map. You can see the basins, the river here. This beach here, this long beach, which you saw on the aerial photographs before, that beach was comprised of chert. So all chunks of this chert. Same beach found in Brighton. So you would think from an intelligence point of view, you'd go check out Brighton Beach, you'd try your vehicles on Brighton Beach, and then you'd know exactly what you're going to deal with when you got across the way. Unfortunately, most of the training was done on sand beaches. So when they encountered this chert, it turned out to be disastrous. The overall plan of attack, you had 2, 3, 4, 6, 8 beaches. The outermost beaches were attacked by the Royal Marine Commandos, and their mission was to silence artillery batteries. So these batteries could not fire on the fleet, the destroyers, during the battle. So the color orange was given to these 2 beaches here, and the color yellow given to these 2 beaches here. Then at the main beach here, which was divided in half, red beach and white beach, and had these 2 flank beaches. And the idea on the flank beaches was to attack in the flanks and then move inland and make a pincer movement to come around behind the town, and then the town would be attacked from both sides. And at the same time, these attacks on the flanks would come across the headlands here and deal with the Germans that were up on the cliffs. Green Beach here was the South Saskatchewan Regiment and the Cameron Highlanders of Canada from Winnipeg. Blue Beach over here, Royal Regiment of Canada. And then the main beaches, White Beach was the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, Red Beach was the Essex Scottish, and the FMR, Fusilier Mont-Royal, and the Royal Marine Commandos were the reserve. And the tanks would only land at the main beach. So no tanks at Green Beach or Blue Beach or at the outer ones. Same aerial photograph before. I'll just point out this picture was taken here, up on this cliff. So you're looking across the river and you'd be looking down at the beaches here. And it was one of the missions for the people at Blue Beach to come around and attack the Germans on these cliff faces here and stop the fire going down onto the main beaches. And the chalk cliffs, as I said, same as across the channel at Dover. So, an overview of what happened on the day. Evening of August 18th, the convoy left from 5 different ports. It assembled out in the channel, and it went through had a path opened up through a German minefield for the convoy to pass through. And at about 3 o'clock in the morning, they were positioned off Dieppe. So they loaded out the commandos to go to Orange and Yellow Beach, but as the Yellow Beach landing craft headed off, they ran into, of all things, a German coastal convoy that was running along the coast to Dieppe. And there was a firefight, and it totally knocked apart the attack there, and the landing craft went every which way. And in the end, the commander canceled the attack on Yellow Beach, but the order didn't get to all of the landing craft. So an attack was still mounted with limited resources. The Orange Beach assault, which was led by Lord Lovett, went off at 4:45 and went off pretty successfully. Yeah. And at the same time, or about 10 minutes later, they attacked Yellow Beach, not so successfully. And at this same time, the South Saskatchewan Regiment, later followed by the Camerons, landed on Green Beach. And running late, the Royal Regiment of Canada landed on Blue Beach. They were running about 10 minutes late, a combination of mechanical problems with the landing craft and some navigating problems and assembling the flotilla. And then also running late, at 5:23, the main beaches were attacked by the Essex Regiment and the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, and they were followed by the tanks. But the tanks were supposed to be there first, so they were running quite late. At about 7 o'clock, 7 o'clock in the morning, there was a misinterpreted communication from the beach. The communication to the beaches was really poor, and the commander thought that the beach had been taken, and he sent in the reserve. So the reserves went in, and then later on, likewise at 9 o'clock, the second reserves went in. So first it was the Fusilier Mont-Royal at 7 o'clock, and then the 40th Royal Marine Commandos went in at 9 o'clock. And this was a very big mistake because the beaches had not been taken. And not long after they sent in the Royal Marine Commandos, at 10:30, they commenced withdrawal. They realized it was a disaster. I thought, well, let's pull out whoever we can. And they attempted for about an hour. And at 11:30, they basically gave up. And they assembled the ships in a convoy, and at various times the ships departed from the beaches and left the soldiers behind. And at but after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the last Canadian onshore surrendered. Yeah, well, first of all, crossing the channel, as I said, they assembled from 5 different ports here. They came together here, and the Royal Navy minesweepers had cleared a path through the German minefield, and then they came assembled here, and this represents this Yellow Beach landing craft running into the German convoy that had been coming along the coast. So there was a loss of surprise, and surprise was a big factor in the plan. Well, we're going to have surprise, so that'll, let's say, overcome some of the other faults in the plan, like they won't know we're coming, so yeah. But surprise was lost. So Yellow Beaches, they had 23 landing craft assigned to assault Yellow Beaches. They ran into these armed trawlers, they had the firefight, the escorts got scattered, and landing craft got scattered. But the German coastal defenses knew then that something was going on. And they did spot on radar the craft, but they failed to discern between these craft and the convoy, the German convoy. So at 4:55, only one landing craft landed on Yellow 2 Beach. And that one landing craft with only 20 men assaulted the gun battery. And they didn't have enough men to take it, but what they did do is they managed to take some high ground, and they were able to pour fire down into the battery and keep the Germans away from the guns. So they did that for about 2.5 hours. So there was limited success. And as they ran out of ammunition at about 8 o'clock, on the same landing craft they came in on, they were withdrawn. But at 5 o'clock on the other beach at Yellow 1, 6 out of the 23 landing craft came in under heavy fire, and they never got off the beach. There were 120 commandos, and they fought until they ran out of ammunition and eventually surrendered at 10 o'clock. So it was a limited success. They prevented the gun battery from firing for about 2 hours. Yeah, that's Yellow Beach 1. An interesting fact is this chap here, Ed Loustalot from Louisiana, a U.S. Army Ranger. He was killed on Yellow Beach, and he was the first American to be killed in the European theater of operation during World War II. Orange Beaches at the other end. This was the Lord Lovett, and this was totally successful. They landed on the beaches. They were under German fire, but they got off the beaches. They moved inland. They destroyed the battery, and then at 8:50, they all got back in their landing craft and withdrew, and they only lost 12 men. So that was the only shining success in the raid. And this was the worst. Blue Beach. Blue Beach, the Royal Regiment of Canada. This is the beach. That's it. So you can see this section here. This is where the exit road is from the beach, and this is where the Royal Regiment was landed. Narrow beach, and the cliffs are up above, and the Germans are on the cliffs, and the Germans are also over here. And there was really no hope from the very start. So at 4:30, a German searchlight picked up the landing craft, and at 5 o'clock, running late, the first wave landed. The reason there were waves is they got so messed up that some of the landing craft were so far behind that the first group landed, and then the other group came later. The Germans let fly with everything. They had artillery, they had 20-millimeter cannons, mortars, machine guns, small arms fire. The whole lot was poured onto the landing craft as they came in. And at 5:30, the second wave came in, including this chap here, Jack Poulton, who will pop up a few times in this presentation. He was a friend of my father. So the landing beach became a killing field. The people who got on shore were able to hide behind the seawall. The Germans were up above throwing hand grenades down on them. They had nobody to shoot at, so they were basically just sitting there getting picked off by the Germans. They couldn't escape from the beach. At noon, they surrendered, and among the last to give up was Jack Poulton. Yeah, so that's the beach. This is the beach today, and you can see there's a motel up here, and there's a house, and the exit road is here. And this was the beach in 1942. You got the seawall. The soldiers got out of the landing craft, had to run through all this gunfire, got to the seawall, and then all they could do was hide behind the seawall. And the reason they couldn't get off the beach was at the exit road, there were 3 bunkers. One here, one here, and one up here, all with machine guns in them. And those bunkers are set up to shoot along the beach. So hence they were able to pick the Canadians off on the beach who were trying to hide behind the seawall. And Jack Fulton, his story, I think a lot of people in the room would have seen Saving Private Ryan. His experience was almost identical to what they showed with Tom Hanks. He was the last guy off his landing craft, and the landing craft was starting to reverse as he moved up to the ramp. And by the time he stepped off, it was away from the beach, and he stepped into 3 meters of water. And lucky for him, he landed on his feet, and he sensed the angle of the beach and started walking uphill. And as he looked up, just like you saw on Saving Private Ryan, he could see the water was pink, he could see the bullets going through. And as his head came out of the water, the first thing he saw was his company sergeant major with one of his eyeballs hanging out. And he helped the sergeant major to the seawall under fire. Anyway, that was Jack's war. That was 7 hours. And the rest of the time was spent in prisoner of war camps. He was a big guy. He was about 6'3", 200 odd pounds. You can see he looks like could be a footy player. Okay, main beaches, Red Beach. Red Beach was the beach closest to the river. You can see all this chert shingle here. This is what it looked like in 1942. And you had the beach, and then you had a seawall, and then you had a whole bunch of barbed wire. So in order to get off the beach, you had to get over the seawall and through the barbed wire. And it was Essex Scottish. So they landed at 5:23 under heavy fire. They got up the seawall. Some of them who couldn't get the seawall used their helmets to dig pits in the shingle. Very poor communication with the headquarters ship, which is why they sent in the reserves when they shouldn't have. The company sergeant major managed to get off the beach with a small squad. He managed to get into the town. They used up their ammunition. They came back, so it couldn't do much. And as I told you before, the reserves came in at 7 o'clock. They were supposed to land on Red Beach, but there was a smoke screen that had been laid by the destroyers. So as the landing craft came through, they got a bit disoriented, and they ended up landing on both beaches. So they were on the left and the right side. There would be about 500 men in the FMR. 100 men were hit before they even got to the beach. So they get onto the beach, sheltered behind the seawall, same story. And then around 11 o'clock, they tried to evacuate them. They did manage to get troops off, but the fire was so heavy that they gave up after about 15 minutes. And White Beach, which was further away from the river, White Beach had this headland, and the Germans were up on the cliff, machine guns, some artillery pieces, whatever, and they were shooting down the beach. So this is what the beach looked like in 1942, picture taken from the headland. This is the casino. And you can see the tide is going out here, so this is after the battle. And so this is Red Beach here, White Beach here. So the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, they managed to get up the beach, they got through the barbed wire, and eventually they were able to capture the casino. So you see it there a little bit clearer. Yeah, they took the casino, and then the casino became their fire base. And they were in the casino for about 3 hours before the withdrawal started. So landing at the same time as the landing on Red Beach, up to the seawall, same story. You had the reserves come in about 7 o'clock. 3 small squads at different times managed to get into the town. And I highlight this guy here because his name will pop up again in the presentation. Captain Dennis Whitaker was commanding one of them. Got into the town, had a bit of a firefight, ran out of ammunition, had to go back to casino. And same story, about 11 o'clock, the landing craft came in under heavy fire, and soldiers saw the landing craft, ran out of the casino, and tried to get out the landing craft. Some made it, some didn't. The armor came in, as I said before, a bit late. They should have been in before the infantry. So you had artillery, anti-tank fire, mortars. A number of the landing craft tanks were sunk or disabled. There were 29 tanks in the first wave, attempted to land. Only 15 got out of the landing craft. The commander of the Calgary tanks, Colonel Anders, he was told by the coxswain, "You can go." He drove the tank off and went straight down, and the tank was totally submerged. And he popped out and he tried to get into a boat, and he was shot and killed. The tanks that did get on the beach struggled in the shingle, bogging or breaking tracks. Only 9 tanks got off the beach. They got up on the esplanade, but they couldn't get off the esplanade because of the anti-tank obstacles, which the engineers were supposed to clear, but the engineers were either dead or stuck in landing craft that didn't land. And the second wave was aborted. Once they saw what was going on, the next 30 tanks never landed. That's kind of what the beach looked like after the battle was over. This was Colonel Anders' tank here. The tide is going out, so the tank is now exposed. And you can see here how the tanks have bogged in the shingle and just couldn't really make headway. And it was the same thing for rubber-tired vehicles. These were command cars, scout cars that were to be used by the brigadiers, and you can see them bogged right up to the axles in the shingle. And you can see here the tanks, the Churchill tanks, the chert got in amongst the bogies, caused stress, which snapped the pins holding the tracks together, and then the tracks just rolled off the tanks. Okay, down the coast at Pourville, Green Beach, which was the South Saskatchewans and the Cameron Highlanders. They had a pretty good beach to land on, and a river dumps in here, the River C. And a bit of a mistake was made, and they ended up landing on the wrong side of the river. They should have been on this side, and they were landed on the far side. So there was a bridge they had to cross to get to where they needed to be. Yeah, so they managed to land. They managed to capture the town of Pourville. They pushed inland. They did try to capture the radar station up on the cliff, but it was too well defended, so they couldn't take it. The Camerons came in after the South Saskatchewans, and very Scottish thing, led by their piper. The colonel of the Camerons was killed just as he got up on the beach. They managed to go get inland with there was heavy resistance, and they were supposed to wait for the tanks and the infantry from White Beach, which of course never turned up. And German tanks started to turn up. So when no support showed itself, the Camerons and the South Saskatchewan pulled back into the town of Pourville, went down on the beach, and withdrawal commenced. And the withdrawal was not too bad. A fair number of men managed to get off the beach. About 100 men ended up being left overall, and the commanding officer of the South Saskatchewans. And when they ran out of ammunition, they surrendered. The battle in the air. This was the biggest single-day air battle of the Second World War. There were so many planes in the air, they were colliding. The RAF had about 750 fighters in the battle. They flew about 2,500 sorties. I've seen a number of 3,000, but I took the lower number. At any one time, there were between 3 and 9 squadrons of fighters over the beach, out of the 62 that overall were in the battle. The Germans, once they realized what was going on, they started bringing aircraft in from all over Western Europe and the Low Countries. So they even brought aircraft in from Denmark and Western Germany, and ended up with about 950 planes in the battle. To give you an idea how big the battle was, the Luftwaffe used up all of its 20mm cannon ammunition held in France and the Low Countries. And one thing that came out of the battle, the Focke-Wulf 190 had only recently been introduced, and likewise the Spitfire Mark 9. And it was found that the Spitfire Mark 9 was a match for the Focke-Wulf 190. But the Focke-Wulf 190 ran circles around all the earlier marks of Spitfires and, of course, the Hurricanes. But luckily, all the German aircraft were not Focke-Wulf 190s. A lot of them were Me-109s, which the older Spitfires could deal with. Were there Australians there on the day? Yes, there were. I don't have precise numbers, but there were tens of Australian and Kiwi pilots in the air. This is just a story of one chap. This is Flight Sergeant Charles Watson from Carlton in Victoria. He was flying a Hurricane, and he was flying the Hurricane over, he was pretty well over the river, and he was hit by flak, and he went down offshore and ended up paddling to shore and being captured by the Germans and went to a POW camp. And this article here, I noticed, was in the Australian War Memorial. It's a newspaper article about Australian pilots being interviewed after coming back from Dieppe. So what did it cost? It's pretty bad, really. Out of the 6,000 men who landed, there were 3,600 casualties, 68%. 1/3 of them were due to mortar fire. And this was because when a mortar shell landed on the beach and the beach was covered in chert, the chert exploded. And so it was like a force multiplier. You'd have the shrapnel from the mortar shell, and then you'd have all of these broken pieces of chert flying around, injuring the soldiers as well. A bit over 1,000 men either missing in action or killed in action. And half of them died without getting to the beach. To put it in context, Omaha Beach, Saving Private Ryan, 770 men were killed. And here's 1,000 died at Dieppe. And on the Canadian beach on D-Day, Juno Beach, 340. After the battle, for the next 3 weeks, they found floating corpses all along the Channel coast, as far up as into Belgium. 475 all up corpses were recovered. There were 600 wounded, about 2,000 POWs. The 29 tanks and crews were lost, and the 2nd Canadian Division effectively no longer existed. Canada took more casualties on that day than it did in all the rest of World War II. But it wasn't all one-sided. The Germans also had 600 soldiers killed. And here you can see bodies being collected from the beach. As soon as the battle was over, a German officer went down on the beach and he was walking around. There was all these guys with arms and legs missing, whatever, and they were dying, and he was shooting them with his pistol just to put them out of their misery. And this is my relative who was there. This was my dad's cousin, 21 years old, kind of a skinny guy. He was a baker. Usually don't see skinny bakers. Yeah. But when the war was over, he wanted to become a fitter and work at the steel mill where his dad worked. Anyway, he signed up in 1940. He finally got to see some action in the raid. And what happened to him is he got into the casino with the other guys from the Royal Hamiltons. And you can see the casino better detailed in this picture here. They fought in the casino for about 3 hours, and then when they saw the rescue landing craft coming, he ran out and he hid behind this landing craft. And the Germans were shooting down from the headland. And then I guess he thought he saw an opening and he made a break for it, and he was shot just behind this landing craft. And the last time his body was seen, he was floating in the water behind this landing craft. Royal Navy. One of the destroyers was sunk, and it was sunk by a fluke. They were chasing, fighters were chasing a bomber, and the bomber, as it went over this destroyer, it jettisoned its bomb. And damned if the bomb didn't go right down and went through the deck, went right through the ship and blew up underneath the ship and broke its back. And who was the 4-inch gun loader on the ship? This chap here from Melbourne, Douglas Gilling, who died 101 in 2023, which makes him just about one of the last survivors to pass away. And in the Australian War Memorial, you can hear a tape of his experiences on the day.
I'm quite convinced, as a lowly sailor serving a 4-inch gun on one of the destroyers there, that at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning when we got there, it seemed to me that all hell had broken loose and that we were expected.
The Brocklesby was almost sunk. It was hit by artillery fire in the stern. It started to go down by the stern, and its crew did a tremendous job of plugging the leaks, pumped the water out, got the engines restarted, and they managed to pull away on their own power. 33 landing craft lost, and a total of 550 naval personnel killed or wounded. So that's a pretty big number for a naval battle. Royal Air Force, 106 aircraft lost, the RAF, 32 to anti-aircraft and accidents. There were so many aircraft in the air, Spitfires are running into Spitfires. And also they had just introduced the Hawker Typhoon, which had some structural problems. And two of the Typhoons, when they went into a dive, their tails came off. The Luftwaffe came to 127, so they were a bit high. It was the heaviest battle loss, single-day battle loss in the Second World War for the RAF. They got 20 pilots rescued in the Channel, 113 aircrew died, 40 aircrew wounded, and a bunch more became POWs. The Germans lost 48 aircraft, the RAF claimed 91. There were 21 German pilots killed, and big thing here was the advantage that the RAF had in the Battle of Britain had been lost, where they could be shot down over their own territory, recovered, and be back in an airplane next day. Now they're fighting over enemy territory, and they lose a pilot, and the pilot's gone. Unless it was lucky enough to be picked up by one of the ships. Lessons learned. Okay, intelligence and planning needs vast improvements, and make sure that all the lessons learned are employed. The invasion plan needs to be much less complicated and has to have flexibility. So none of this be here at 10:15 and over here at 10:21. The pre-assault aerial bombing, mandatory. Pre-assault naval bombardment, mandatory. And capital ships are needed, not just for the pre-assault naval bombardment, but then to supply artillery support after the landing. Good communication from the beach to the ships and back. This was terrible at Dieppe, which is why the reserve was landed and all these guys were killed when it shouldn't have happened. Nice to have direct beach to tactical support aircraft communications. The comms at Dieppe were supposed to be an officer on the beach talks to the command ship, talks to the RAF in Uxbridge, and the RAF in Uxbridge talks to wherever the hell the airplanes are, and then the airplanes come in and do their job. It wasn't until later on in the war that troops were able to talk directly to the aircraft. Big lesson learned, frontal attack, capturing a functioning channel port is pretty unlikely. And hence, we had the Mulberries on D-Day, the floating harbor. Need specialized armored fighting vehicles, and hence General Percy Hobart's funnies. He had tanks that flailed and blew up mines. He had tanks that dumped wood into anti-tank trenches and things. Mobile artillery must land with the infantry. There wasn't any artillery support on the day, but they came up with these ideas here to take a tank chassis and put an artillery piece on it. And hence, D-Day landing, they had these, they called them sextons and priests. One of the guys in this was Scotty, James Doohan. He was a artilleryman in the Canadian Army, landed on D-Day. The engineers need protection during the landings. Yeah, they just can't be out there doing their business and getting mowed down by machine guns. So they came up with the AVRE, Armored Vehicle Royal Engineers, a tank that the engineers could carry their equipment in and be sheltered from fire as they got onto the beaches. And the landing craft, they needed more types and better quality than the landing craft that they had used at Dieppe. Heroes, as you can see from the table, there were a lot of medals given out on the day, but the only one that I encountered that I didn't think was warranted was they gave one to the commander, Hamilton Roberts, and they just gave it to him because he was there. Padre, John Ware Foote, not often you see Padre wins the Victoria Cross. He landed on White Beach, he got up to the seawall, and his role was really to minister to dying people, but he said, no, I'm here at the regimental aid post. I'm going to go and I'm going to help guys on the beach. So he started crawling out under machine gun fire and grabbing wounded soldiers and pulling them back into the shelter of the seawall. And he did this umpteen times. And then when the rescue craft turned up, he declined to get on the rescue craft. He stayed with the wounded soldiers. So he was given a Victoria Cross, and the armory in Hamilton, Ontario is named in his honor. Royal Marines on Orange Beach, or the Orange Beaches. This chap here, he was wounded numerous times, led a charge against the artillery battery. He was wounded so many times that when they captured the battery, he fell over, passed out from loss of blood. And Lord Lovett, commanding the commandos, he likewise ran through a hail of fire a few times during the assault on the batteries. Commander of the South Saskatchewan Regiment in Green Beach was Cecil Merritt, and he was awarded a VC. I told you they landed on the wrong side of the river, so they had to get across this bridge, and there was a German pillbox with machine guns in it. They tried to get across, and a whole bunch of guys were killed, and they were laying on the roadway. And Merritt went out onto the bridge and started waving his helmet, said, "Come on, guys, we can make it. It's not that big a deal." And so they got up and went. Ran across the beach, and somebody threw hand grenades into the bunker, and they made it. But he was standing there on the bridge with all this machine gun fire, waving his helmet, saying, "Come on, let's go." This guy, Captain Romuald Nalisz-Tyminski, DSC. He was the commander of the Polish destroyer, Hunt-class destroyer. He saw what was going on Blue Beach. He disobeyed an order that had been given by Hughes Hallett not to get in close to the beach and assist the soldiers. He took his destroyer right up to the beach and brought it around so close that he was throwing up rocks and mud as the stern came around. And then he stopped. And he started picking up swimming soldiers from Blue Beach. And in total, they picked up 85 soldiers from the beach, and all the while they're fighting off aircraft, because once the Germans saw this destroyer sitting there, not moving, they immediately commenced attacking. His gunners shot down 4 German planes, and 5 of the gunners were killed. And he only pulled away when he was running out of anti-aircraft ammunition, and there were no more swimmers. So when he got back to port, they were going to give him a court-martial for disobeying orders. And then when the Canadian Army brass heard about it, they had a word with the Royal Navy, and that got changed around into a Distinguished Service Cross. This guy here, remember I said the reserves came in at 9 o'clock? This was the 40th Royal Marine Commando. They came in through this smoke screen, and as they came through the smoke screen, the commander was on the lead boat, and he saw what was going on the beaches, and he realized it was a disaster. And he stood up on the bow, and he apparently had a pair of white gloves on, and he was signaling them, "Go back, go back." And he only did that for about 10 seconds, and then he was killed. I don't know why, but they never gave him a medal. Douglas Cato, commander of the Royal Regiment of Canada, he found a ravine with a squad of guys, and they went up this ravine, got through the barbed wire, and then he climbed a cliff. He and his squad climbed this cliff, but he was seen by the Germans, and the commander of the Germans said, no, don't shoot them. Don't shoot them. We'll capture them when they get to the top. So he got to the top, and they for a while they hid in a copse of trees, and then eventually the Germans went and captured him. The guy who was leading the troops was Captain Richard Schnosenberg. After the war, Cato went to Germany, and he found Schnosenberg in a prisoner of war camp. And they got him out, whatever, and they became friends for life. This guy here was the commander of the Fusilier Mont Royal, the floating reserve that went in at 7 o'clock. And he was wounded 5 times. He was laying on the beach, he was bleeding all over the place, and he was still commanding. And in the end, he was carried off the beach into one of the rescue landing crafts. He was the only regimental commander to be recovered on the day. This chap here was the one who recovered him, Sergeant Pierre Dubuc. Dubuc started out by getting into the Colonel Andrews's tank, the one that had been drowned. And this guy's an infantryman, but he figured out how to work the gun. He was in there with another guy, and they started shooting at German positions. And he actually took out 5 batteries before they ran out of ammunition. Then he got out of the tank, got up on the beach, pulled together a squad of men, and they managed to get across the barbed wire and into the town. They get into town, they get in a firefight with the Germans, and they ran out of ammunition. Germans captured them. They took their pants so they wouldn't run away. So these guys are all standing there in their underwear, but they only left one guard. And Dubuc overpowered the guard and killed him with his bare hands. And then he and his men returned to the beach. He gets back to the beach, the landing craft have turned up, and he starts carrying wounded men out to the landing craft. And one of the men he picks up is his CO. So he carried him out, he went back, he got one more guy, and then just as the landing craft were pulling away, he got on. And he was given a military medal. This guy here, Jack Nissenthal, Jewish guy, pretty brave just to go, if you're Jewish. He was a radar specialist, and it was his job to disassemble the radar unit after it had been captured at Green Beach and take these components back to UK. So it was a secret mission. He knew so much about British radar that they put a 10-man bodyguard onto him. If he was looking like he was going to be captured, the bodyguard was supposed to kill him. So they couldn't capture the radar station, but this guy was pretty smart, and he had a thought, and he climbed up this 5-meter pole that had communication cables on it, and he cut the communication cables, knowing then that the Germans would have to use radio to communicate what they were seeing on the radar. And that was being monitored back in England. So they were able to determine what the radar unit could do from the transmissions via radio that had been caused by this guy cutting the cables. He made it back to England with only one of his bodyguards. Many years later, they had a reunion, South Saskatchewan Regiment, and this Cockney guy turns up, and everybody's wondering, who the hell is this guy? And it turns out it's Jack. He had moved to Canada, became a Canadian citizen. Bad guys. Okay, Churchill for basically going with the bad idea. Mountbatten, he was like a front man. He liaised with Churchill, kind of did what Churchill liked to hear. Wasn't a details man, never got down in the weeds. So he didn't really see the flaws in the plan. Montgomery, he saw the flaws in the plan, but he declined to do anything about it. These guys here, the Canadian generals, they were the guys that pushed for the Canadians to be part of the raid, or the main part of the raid, but then didn't follow up and monitor what was going on with the plan. So it was left to this guy here, Hamilton Roberts, the overall commander, to basically object. And he didn't feel, if all of these other people had passed the plan, that he had the authority to object. And then there, of course, was the guy who made the plan. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. And that's basically what Hamilton Roberts did. He declined to speak up when he should have. He was so ashamed of what had happened, he never went back to Canada. After the war, he moved to Jersey, and he died in Jersey. So, the aftermath. They pulled together, the guys who could march, were pulled together, and they had to march 65 kilometers to the city of Rouen overnight. Jack Poulton, he had swallowed a bunch of salt water when he went off the landing craft, and he had this raging thirst. They didn't have any water. And on the way to Rouen, they would stop and they'd let them sit down in the field and rest. He'd go dig a hole in the field and stick his face in the hole. And he was sucking water out of the dirt. When they got to Rouen, they were put in a train and they were railed all the way across Europe to Stalag 8B, Lambsdorff in Silesia. Silesia was part of Germany. Now this is a map of Poland here. Now it's part of Poland. It was part of the Auschwitz complex. You had Krakow was over here, then Auschwitz, and then these POW camps. And notice there's a Stalag Luft here, which is a camp for airmen. There were Australians in this Stalag Luft. Because the plan that was captured on the beach mentioned in it that prisoners would be manacled before they were taken back to England, the Germans manacled all these guys when they arrived in the prisoner of war camp. And they wore these manacles for a year and a half. And so did the Aussies in the Stalag Luft. But very quickly, the guys figured out how to pick the locks. So they would wear the manacles during the parade, and then when they got back into the camp, they would just take the manacles off and put them away. And eventually, the Germans worked out that they weren't wearing the manacles, and and they gave up. Jack Poulton. Jack arrives at the camp. He hadn't eaten for 2 days, and they have this thin gruel, this soup. He'd lost all his gear. Most of the guys had nothing to eat with. And Jack was dying to eat, so he pulled his boot off. He said, fill the boot with soup. And he ate the soup out of his boot. Eventually, he found a tin can, and for the next year, he used the tin can as his mess kit. He told my dad that if it wasn't for the Red Cross parcels, they would have died. He said there just wasn't enough, the Germans didn't give them enough food. But they got Red Cross parcels that came in and they had all this stuff in them, and that's what really kept them going. Remember this guy, Dennis Whitaker. He was a captain on the day of the raid. 2 years later, the Canadians were given the honor of liberating Dieppe. And when they turned up, the Germans basically evacuated the town. They didn't want to fight. And it was Whitaker that was leading the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry. He had gone from being a captain to being lieutenant colonel, commander of the regiment. So it wasn't over. It wasn't over for the POWs. February 1945, as the Russians advanced into Poland, the Germans grabbed all the POWs and put them on the road. It was like the kind of like the Sandakan Death March. These guys were all lined up, and these photos actually come from the Australian War Memorial, because there were photos taken of the Aussie airmen that came from Stalag Luft 344. They headed off and they marched. Over here is Krakow in Poland. Auschwitz is like here, and the camp somewhere around here. Jack Poulton walked all the way across Germany to the center of Germany, the Harz Mountains. And it was here that they were finally freed by American soldiers. There's a picture here, again from the Australian War Memorial, showing them on the march. If you dropped out, you were shot. Big incentive to keep going. I should mention, when Jack Poulton was finally liberated, he had weighed a bit over 200 pounds. When he was captured, he weighed 80 pounds. So a lot of the people who were killed in the battle buried at this Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery in Dieppe. There are about 950 burials, a lot of Canadians. 187 of them have no known graves. This is a picture of the cemetery when the Canadians came back in September 1944. Initially, the Germans dug a big hole and just put all the bodies in the pit, covered it up, and there was a mound. And then the German high command heard about it and said, no, that is not what we're going to do. So they sent out 500 troops. They exhumed all the bodies, and they properly buried them all, and they identified the ones that they could identify. For those who bodies were lost, they're commemorated here in Surrey, the Brookwood Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery. There's a memorial here, and the names, including the name of my dad's cousin, are on this memorial. Every year, the town of Dieppe has a holiday on August the 19th, and they have a parade, and all of the units that were in the raid turn up, some representatives. In this case, you see the pipe band of the Essex and Kent Scottish regiment that landed on Red Beach. And this is the mayor giving his speech. There were the last two veterans of White Beach back in 2003, Royal Hamilton Light Infantry. And the last raiders died in 2023, including Doug Gilling. And last slide. So the Dieppe Bar. Well, first of all, I'll just mention this. Every 5 years, I put this memorial in the Hamilton Spectator, just to remember my dad's cousin. Yeah, and the Thompson. Why the Thompson? Well, as I say, the design of the bar was left to the veterans, and they specifically put the Thompson in there. And the Canadian government never realized what was going on. It took 52 years for the government to issue this bar. It was issued in 1994 when a lot of the veterans had already died. And the reason they put the Thompson there was because it symbolized a screw up. At midnight on the way over, an announcement came out in the tannoys of the ships. Anybody's got a Thompson, bring it to the ordnance guys had set up to collect them all. So they took all their Thompson submachine guns away and they gave them Sten guns. Still in the factory grease. So they cleaned up the grease, and then the Sten guns, they realized the actions were all jammed up. So then there was a mad scramble to borrow files from the ship engineers to file the actions to make the Sten guns work. So that was the beginning. That was the first indication to the troops that this was going to be one hell of a screw up. That's my presentation. And
do you know what frontline ammunition those soldiers carried?
yeah, Jack Poulton had 250 rounds of .303.
Yeah.
And then the NCOs for the Sten guns, I'm not sure how much they carried, but it was 9mm. And the idea of the Sten gun, it was the same caliber as the German pistols and machine pistols.
But did anyone end up getting their Thompsons back with the 45?
All the 45 caliber ammunition stayed on the ships.
Have you ever seen a movie-tone newsreel called that?
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I was looking at it yesterday.
A question of not appreciating Brighton Beach.
Yeah.
I think at the time Brighton Beach would have been full of mines and barbed wire.
Yes, yes, and that was the thing. Well, apart from that, it was too public.
Of course.
So they needed to find a quiet place to do it, and the quiet place was up and around the corner and whatever, but the beaches were sand. So, but nonetheless, you could have thought you might try driving a vehicle somewhere where there aren't any mines and seeing how you'd go, but that just totally escaped them. Spin doctors went to work, and Canadian victory on the beaches and all this, and that went on for about 2 weeks. Bear in mind, no, we don't have the communications back then that we have today. And then the casualty list started appearing in the newspapers. And my dad told me that if they were saying that if you didn't know someone who was in the raid, odds are you knew someone who knew someone that was in the raid. It affected Canada that greatly. But once the casualty lists started coming out, and people started to realize how many hundreds and hundreds of people had been killed and wounded and captured, the government seriously had to change the story.